There's a man who once weighed 297 pounds. He was working nights as an exterminator, spraying poison in the backs of restaurants for a few dollars an hour. His life had one direction, and that direction was down. 3 months later, he was 106 pounds lighter and standing at the doorway of Navy SEAL training. Not a year later, 3 months. Now your first instinct is probably the same as mine. That's not normal. Something must be different about him. Better genetics. Some hidden gift the rest of us weren't born with. Here's the strange part. He wasn't gifted. He had a learning disability. He had a hole in his heart he didn't even know about, one that had been quietly cutting his oxygen supply roughly in half his entire life. And the childhood he came from was the kind most people never fully recover from. So how does a man like that become, by many accounts, one of the toughest human beings alive? That question is the reason this video exists, because the answer isn't about him. It's about something buried inside you that you've probably never been forced to find. His name is David Goggins, and before we get to who he became, you have to understand where he started, because the whole point is that the starting line doesn't decide the finish. Picture a big house in Buffalo, New York, a Rolls-Royce in the driveway, a Corvette, a family that from the street looks like the American dream stitched together perfectly. Now step inside. Inside that house, a little boy is being made to work at his father's roller rink until the middle of the night, night after night, so exhausted he can barely stay awake in school. Inside that house, his father beats his mother, beats him. One night when David is around 6 years old, he watches his father hurt his mom, and something in him snaps, and he jumps onto his father's back to try to protect her. He gets beaten for it, badly. And here's a detail that tells you everything about what that home did to a child. One night his father held a loaded pistol between his eyes, and David didn't flinch. Not because he was brave, because, in his own words, he no longer cared whether he lived or died. That's not toughness. Let's be honest about that. That's a little boy so broken that death had stopped scaring him. I'm telling you this not to shock you, but because it matters for what comes next. Because most stories like this end exactly where you'd expect. The abused kid grows up angry or numb or lost, and for a long time that's precisely what happened. His mother eventually escaped. She had a credit card for months, planned everything in secret, and one morning packed her 2 boys into a car and drove away for good. Even the escape wasn't clean. The car broke down. They spent a night sleeping in a hotel conference room because there were no rooms left. Freedom, it turns out, isn't one clean break. It's a series of obstacles you refuse to let stop you. But leaving didn't fix him. They moved to a small town in Indiana, and now David faced something new. He was one of the only black kids for miles. He found a death threat scrawled inside his school workbook. A stranger once pointed a gun at him on a country road, and the years of trauma had wrecked his ability to learn, so he did what a scared kid does. He cheated. He faked his way through school. He even doctored his own report cards, turning F's into B's, hoping no one would ever check. And here's the thing about lying your way through life. It works, right up until the moment it doesn't. That moment came the summer before his senior year. A letter arrived. He was failing. He wasn't going to graduate. Every shortcut had finally run out of road. Now most of us know that feeling. Not this extreme, but the feeling of a bill coming due for all the ways we've quietly avoided the truth. And most of us in that moment do what feels natural. We look away. David did something else. He walked into the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror, and looked directly at himself. And instead of the comforting lies we usually tell our reflection, he said the brutal truth. You're lazy. You're a liar. You stand for nothing. You're an embarrassment. It sounds harsh. It was supposed to be. Because here's what he'd stumbled onto, and it's the first real tool in this entire story. He calls it the accountability mirror, and the idea behind it is deceptively simple. You cannot fix a problem you refuse to name. Think about how much energy we spend softening the truth about ourselves. We're not overweight, we're working on it. We're not broke, we're between things. We're not avoiding the hard conversation, we're waiting for the right time. Every one of those soft phrases is a tiny lie, and Goggins would argue those lies are the most comfortable prison a human being ever builds. He calls denial the ultimate comfort zone, and that phrase deserves a second. We think comfort is a warm bed and a full fridge, but the deepest comfort of all is not having to look honestly at your own life. So he started writing the truth on sticky notes and putting them on his mirror. Not motivational quotes, tasks, make your bed, cut the grass, study 3 hours, and he'd cross them off one by one and replace them with harder ones. No app, no digital reminder, physical notes he had to face every single morning. And slowly something shifted. The grades came up. The body changed. He passed the test he needed and joined the Air Force. But I want you to notice what actually changed here, because it's easy to miss. It wasn't motivation. He didn't wake up one day feeling inspired. In fact, Goggins would tell you motivation is one of the most useless words in the English language. His words are blunter than that. Motivation, he says, is crap. It changes exactly nobody, because motivation is a feeling and feelings evaporate. What replaced it was something that doesn't evaporate, a habit of doing the hard thing whether he felt like it or not. Hold on to that, because it's about to be tested in a way most people never experience. Fast forward, that Air Force career fizzled, and this is where we meet him at that lowest point, the exterminator, the 297 pounds, the joyless nights. One evening at work, a ceiling panel gave way and roaches rained down on him. He ran outside to the dumpster and came face to face with a hissing raccoon. And standing there covered in filth, he just thought, what is my life? That night he went home and tried to run. He made it 400 yards before he had to stop. 400 yards, from a man who would one day run over 100 miles without stopping. And he almost quit right there. He nearly gave up on the whole idea, but he put on an old copy of Rocky, the scene where Rocky keeps getting knocked down and keeps standing back up, and something clicked. He realized he had a habit, a lifelong habit of giving up way too soon. And this is the sentence that changes everything. He realized that not all physical and mental limitations are real. Sit with that for a moment, because your whole life you've had moments where you said, I can't run anymore, I can't stay up, I can't handle this. And you believed it because your body sent you the signal and the signal felt like truth. But what if the signal was lying? That's exactly what Goggins would spend the next 20 years proving. He got into SEAL training, and SEAL training has a legendary breaking point called Hell Week. Over 130 hours of cold, wet, sleepless torture designed for one purpose, to make you quit. He didn't pass on his first try. He got pneumonia. He didn't pass on his second either. He fractured his kneecap near the very end. But somewhere in that misery, he discovered his second tool. During one of the worst nights, freezing and exhausted, instead of collapsing, he rallied his boat crew to lift their heavy boat overhead and scream into the darkness. You can't hurt boat crew too. The instructors, whose entire job was to break these men, stared in disbelief, because you can't break someone who's laughing at the pain. He calls this taking souls, and it's not really about the other person. It's a mental trick. When you're at your absolute limit and you choose defiance instead of surrender, something biological happens. You find a second wind, energy you swore you didn't have. Why does that work? Because of a truth he clung to in every dark moment. All bad things end. The pain you're feeling right now, no matter how bad, is temporary. And the moment you truly believe that, the pain loses its power to command you. But the deepest lesson of his SEAL training didn't happen in the water. It happened on his mother's couch. Facing his third and final attempt, with an unplanned pregnancy on the way and no money, he broke down completely. And in that breakdown, he finally admitted something he'd been hiding for years. He'd been telling people his abusive father was dead. He'd been running from his own past, pretending it didn't exist. And he realized something that applies to every single one of us. He said your character is your foundation. And if you keep piling successes and failures on top of a cracked foundation, the whole structure eventually falls. He had been rejecting his past, and in rejecting his past, he was rejecting himself. So he did the hardest thing. He accepted it, all of it. The father, the abuse, the shame, not because it was okay, but because pretending it wasn't there was quietly poisoning everything he built on top of it. And this is where his central idea finally takes shape. He calls it the calloused mind. Think about your hands. The first time you grip a pull-up bar or a shovel, your palms blister. It hurts, but if you keep going, those blisters turn into calluses. Tough, protective. Now the same bar that shredded your hands does nothing. Goggins argues your mind works exactly the same way. Every hardship you survive is friction, and that friction can build a mental callus that makes future pain easier to handle. But and this is the part people miss, there's a catch. The same hardship can callous you or it can cripple you, and the difference is entirely in how you read it. If you see your suffering as proof that life is against you, that you're a victim, it makes you bitter and afraid. But if you see that same suffering as training, as reps, as the universe accidentally forging you into something stronger, it makes you unbreakable. Same event, opposite outcome. The only variable is the story you tell yourself about it. And once David made that shift, once he stopped seeing his life as a series of things that happened to him and started seeing it as the ultimate training ground, he became almost impossible to stop. He finished Bud S with 2 duct-taped, broken legs. He became one of only a few dozen Black SEALs in history at that time. Now here, where his story leaves the military and enters something almost unbelievable. Some of his SEAL brothers died in a mission in Afghanistan. To honor them and raise money for their children, David decided to run one of the hardest races on Earth, a 135-mile run through Death Valley. But to qualify, he first had to finish a 100-mile race. He had 3 days' notice, and almost no long-distance training. His only regular cardio had been 20 minutes on an elliptical once a week. He ran anyway. By mile 70, his body was in full revolt. He was hallucinating. There was blood in his urine. He was losing control of his own body in ways I'll spare you the details of. And he hid all of it from his wife, terrified she'd pull him from the race. Then she told him the truth. At his current pace, he wasn't going to make the cutoff. And in that shattered moment, something interesting happened in his mind. He realized the race had stopped being about honoring his fallen friends. It had become about him, about one raw question: how much are you actually willing to suffer? And to answer it, he reached for a memory, then another. The day he lost all that weight, the day he passed the test everyone said he'd fail, the day he graduated SEAL training on broken legs. This became his third tool, the cookie jar. The name comes from his childhood. His family was poor, but his mother kept a cookie jar, and pulling out a single cookie was a rare, savored treat. So he built a mental cookie jar filled not with cookies but with victories. Every hard thing he'd ever overcome, stored away, ready to be pulled out in the exact moment he wanted to quit. Because here's the psychology. In your darkest moment, self-doubt whispers that you can't do this, and the cookie jar is your evidence-based response. Actually, I already have. Here's proof. And that proof, felt vividly, not just remembered but re-experienced, can flood you with enough energy to keep going. He finished 101 miles. And this is the tool you can steal today, no matter who you are. You have a cookie jar too. You've overcome things. Maybe you quit a bad habit. Maybe you survived a loss that should have broken you. Maybe you just did something once that scared you. Those aren't just memories. They're fuel. and most people let them collect dust instead of using them. Which brings us, finally, to the single most important idea in his entire philosophy, the one everything else has been building toward. He calls it the 40% rule. And it goes like this. When your mind tells you that you're done, that you've given everything, that there's nothing left in the tank, you have, on average, only used about 40% of your true capacity. 40%. When you feel completely empty, you still have 60% left to give. Now, that sounds like a motivational slogan until you understand the mechanism behind it. Think about a car engine. Most engines have a device called a governor, which limits the fuel and air so the engine can't push past a certain speed. It's a built-in ceiling that stops the machine long before its real limit. Goggins argues your mind has a governor too, and that governor was programmed by your fears, your past pain, your sense of who you are. When things get hard, it sends the signal, stop, enough, you can't. And most of us obey instantly, never realizing that signal fires far, far below our actual limit. But here's the difference between you and that car. The car cannot override its governor. You can. Not instantly. That's important. He's very clear that this isn't magic. You don't remove your governor in a weekend. You do it the way you build any callus, by pushing 5 or 10% past your stopping point over and over for years, resetting your baseline a little higher each time. And he's honest about the limits of this too. This isn't mind-over matter fantasy. He puts it perfectly. You cannot visualize lies. All the belief in the world means nothing if you haven't put in the actual work. The 40% rule doesn't replace preparation. It rewards it. But once you understand it, it changes how you see almost everything. That workout where you stopped, that project you abandoned, that conversation you avoided, how much of that was a real limit and how much was just your governor firing early and you believing it? He tested this idea in ways that are hard to comprehend. He once tried to break the world record for pull-ups in 24 hours. He failed on live television. His muscles gave out. He tried again. This time his hands literally split open, and he developed a condition where his muscle tissue was breaking down dangerously. He had anesthetic injected directly into his open, bleeding palms just so he could keep going, and he still fell short. Most people would take that as a message from the universe. Stop. Instead, he treated each failure like a scientist treats a failed experiment. He calls it an after-action report. No emotion, no self-pity, just cold questions. What went right? What went wrong? What do I fix? He figured out the bar was unstable. Then he figured out his pace was too fast. Each failure handed him a clue. On the third attempt, he broke the record, over 4,000 pull-ups, and here's the lesson hiding inside it. Failure isn't a verdict on who you are. It's data. It's the map showing you where to adjust. The only people who are truly beaten are the ones who refuse to read the map. And there's one detail from that record that I can't stop thinking about. After breaking it, he felt almost nothing. No lasting joy. He describes it by saying his refrigerator is never full. At first that sounds sad, but it's actually the key to his entire life. After his first massive race, a thought came to him that he repeats like a heartbeat through the whole story. There is no finish line. There is no finish line. He isn't chasing a trophy or a moment of arrival, because he's discovered those moments don't last. He's chasing the person he becomes in the pursuit, and that's a race that genuinely never ends. Now, I want to be fair to him, because it would be easy to walk away thinking the answer to life is just to grind yourself into dust. His own story warns against exactly that. Years later, at the peak of his abilities, his body simply collapsed. Mysterious symptoms no doctor could explain. He nearly died. And lying in that bed, believing the end might be near, he didn't feel rage. He felt something he'd never allowed himself to feel, peace. He mentally forgave everyone, his father, the racists, every person who'd ever doubted him. He realized in a strange way they had helped create him. And then he got the diagnosis nobody expected. His body had literally seized up. Years of relentless training with no recovery had left his muscles so tight that blood couldn't properly flow through them. One expert described his muscle as being like a frozen steak, so hard the blood couldn't get in. The cure wasn't more toughness, it was stretching. Hours of it, gentleness, recovery, the exact thing his whole philosophy had ignored. And that might be the most human lesson in the entire book. Even the hardest man alive learned that pure willpower, with no care for the body carrying it, will eventually break. Real strength includes recovery. Real toughness includes forgiveness. He describes the final version of himself with 3 words worth remembering: peaceful but never satisfied. So let's come back to you, because none of this matters if it stays a story about one extreme man. The reason his life is worth understanding is so you can run through Death Valley. It's the quiet suspicion he plants in your mind. The suspicion that the ceiling you've been living under isn't a real ceiling at all. That the limit you hit last week was your governor, not your capacity. That the excuse you've been carrying, however legitimate its origin, has quietly become the thing holding you in place. His whole message lands on one uncomfortable, liberating sentence: you are stopping you. Not your past, not your genetics, not the unfair hand you were dealt. Those are real, and he never pretends otherwise. But between the thing that happened to you and the life you build next, there's a space. And in that space you get to choose the story: victim or trainee, excuse or fuel. Everything we've talked about, the accountability mirror, the cookie jar, the 40% rule, is really just a set of tools for making that choice on purpose, again and again, until it becomes who you are. If any part of this stirred something in you, I genuinely point you toward the book itself, Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. What we covered here is only the skeleton. The book has the flesh, the raw stories, the exact challenges he lays out for the reader, and a voice so direct it feels like he's gripping you by the collar. It is not a comfortable read, but it was never meant to be. It's meant to make you better, not to make you feel better, and that's a rarer thing than it sounds. So here's the question I'll leave you with, the one he built his entire life around. The next time you're certain you've reached your limit, certain there's nothing left, I want you to pause and ask 2 words before you quit. What if? What if the voice telling you to stop is lying? What if you've only reached 40%? What if the person you could become is standing just on the other side of the pain you're about to walk away from? You won't know unless you take one more step. And that step, the one after you were sure you had nothing left, is where the whole thing begins.